It's quite funny, one of the products I've always kind of thought when I started this YouTube channel that it would be fun if somebody sent me one for free is a robot vacuum. And it finally was actually offered to me. So I was very happy to say I'll test this and make a video on this robot vacuum. I guess in my mind there was this potential for faffiness, which would, I think, sort of always potentially get in the way of actually how useful a robot vacuum might be. But I'm actually really pleased to report that this thing does have a place in my workflow, and we are using it in real life here in our house now. And we're going to get into sort of how useful it is in various situations and where it falls down. Interestingly, this isn't a device that's going to replace our Dyson. There's no way I think it can replace a normal handheld vacuum. It's the kind of thing that stops you having to use the handheld vacuum as often. In contrast to something like my robot mower, which actually has replaced my lawnmower. It hasn't replaced the strimmer that I use for around the edges, of course, but it has actually completely replaced the lawnmower. But with this, it's much more about an impact on your day-to-day workflow, reducing the time that you need to use a handheld vacuum and increasing that day-to-day baseline of cleanliness. So when I was offered this Proscenic robot vacuum, I was quite interested because it had the mopping function built in, as well as this sort of self-emptying. Again, with a small robot vacuum, I was always concerned that the potential for having to empty the thing quite frequently, obviously it's not going to have a huge collection bin, the idea being that it's quite small and moves around by itself. I was always concerned you'd have to be emptying the thing all the time. So having a base station that empties the main robot vacuum seemed quite interesting as well. So I was very keen to take a look at this. Now, I must admit, when I first looked at the app that controls and sets all of this up, I was pretty confused. There was kind of no initial walkthrough to explain how it all worked, and I was left kind of scratching my head a little bit as to figure this out. It's got several different modes. I wasn't quite sure how they all worked. And I had this weird error come up saying that I needed to detach the mopping cloth before using it on carpet, and I wasn't quite sure why I was seeing that error. It was quite difficult to get past it. I eventually did get past it, and I actually now have the app set up pretty well. And the functionality in the app is actually much better than I thought it was going to be based on that first impression. Now, the reality is I'm not actually using the app very often now that it's set up and it's mapped the floors that I put this on. Start vacuuming. I've actually set it up with Siri shortcuts, so I can actually just tell it to go from Siri directly on my watch. That seems to be the best way of using this, so I don't have to actually get the app out and trigger it to do that. And it's got quite a few sort of automatic modes, like if you put the mopping attachment on, it will start mopping and vacuuming just with that same Siri shortcut that I used to start its auto cleaning. So it knows if it's got the mop attached, and then it will mop and vacuum at the same time if you start it using its auto mode, which is the Siri shortcut that I use. So that does actually work pretty genuinely well. Now, one of the other workflows that I really figured out with this is that this thing isn't going to be useful if you schedule it, because there's no way you can guarantee that your floor is clear, especially with kids and pets. It's always something that needs to be triggered manually just after you've had a quick whip around and sort of got stuff off the floor. And I think that's fine, because you'd need to do that if you were going to do a manual vacuum anyway. So it works better with that manual triggering. And of course, being able to do that from my watch with Siri does make that convenient enough, I think, to make it a worthwhile kind of process. And what I find myself doing is actually just having that quick tidy up and then triggering the robot to come out and do its auto clean just before we head out of the house somewhere. So we know when we come back, it's finished its work. And, you know, based on having tidied up before it goes out, we know it's not going to run anything over. And then obviously we're scheduling it as a result of us going out as well. So we're not in the house when it's running. And that seems to work really well. It's not super loud, but it is definitely quite noticeable in the room. You wouldn't want this running at night time either, and I think that's another interesting thing. I think one of the ideas with a robot vacuum is that, oh, it's great, you can be doing it while you're asleep. I wouldn't want to go down that road. It's not quite quiet enough to pull that off. And then when it empties itself, that bit is really loud. So the sort of, there's a secondary vacuum inside the base station that sucks everything out of the robot vacuum, and that is really loud. It doesn't run for very long. It's incredibly loud, so you wouldn't want that happening in the middle of the night either. It's quite interesting how my expectations are a little bit different from reality. You know, all these ideas that I thought how it might be used actually aren't the case, but that's not to say that the ways that I do use it now aren't really useful as well. So the technology in this thing is actually pretty remarkable. It's really packed with features. So first of all, the thing itself has got a dustbin, obviously, and a water tank for the mop. So it dribbles the water out onto the mop, keeps it damp at just the right level. It's got this kind of pulse thing that it vibrates the mop surface. So it's actually quite effective as a mop. You know, it's sort of buzzing away all the time with this damp microfiber cloth. And of course, you can take that off easily and wash it and clean it. There's no trouble there. So that does work pretty well. It's got a filter built in, which is obviously replaceable as and when needed. The base station has got a dust bag. Now, they say this is going to last about a month, and I think that's probably pretty true. Obviously, it's a little bit annoying to think in terms of having to replace these bags all the time once a month. So I'm going to experiment, see if I can empty that and reuse it a little bit. Interestingly, in the base station, there's an ultraviolet sanitization thing as well. The idea being, I think, that it stops that smelling if it's sat in there for a month. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be shining through from the outside of the bag, but it is there. So this self-emptying process, when it returns automatically by itself to its base station, it sort of aligns up its sort of hole on the back of it with the suction on the base station, and the vacuum in the base station just literally sucks everything back out of the robot device itself into the bag. Now, where it gets really interesting and very clever is how it maps your room. It actually is scanning the room, and it creates a map of the room. And that's really interesting because it knows where it is. If you pick it up and move it and put it back down again, it spins around, scans where it is, and then it'll show on the map that it knows its new location in your room. And that's really interesting technology. So you can see these maps being generated in the app if you look into it, and it can save up to 5 different floors. So each floor obviously contains different rooms, and then what you can do in those maps is manually put exclusion zones for either mopping or vacuuming or both, as well as create boundaries that it can't go over and things like that. And it suggests that at the top of your stairs you should put a boundary line, but it does actually have this fall detection thing that it will stop it going over the edge. But obviously it's easier just to set it up with the proper perimeter on the map, and then you know it's not having to take that risk every time. So let's talk about cleaning performance. I think where this excels is on hard floors, because obviously it can mop and vacuum at the same time, and the fact that it's not super powerful as a vacuum is not a problem with a hard floor. Obviously it's perfectly capable of getting stuff off a hard floor. It's got a little brush bar in there as well, but it does, interestingly, it does actually do carpets and rugs quite nicely. The brush bar obviously fluffs up the carpet nicely. It does have that freshly vacuumed look to it, and it will keep them reasonably clean. And it is definitely getting dirt out of the carpets because you can see it building up in the bag, obviously. But there are times where, you know, you get a bit of cat hair and it's sort of stuck to the carpet and it can't lift it off. There's just not enough suction and there's not enough agitation from the brush bar to actually lift that cat hair off the carpet. So it's little things like that where it falls down. And of course, on carpet, you are never actually allowing that sort of brush bar to hit right up to the edges of the carpet there. You know, just because it's a circular device and the brush bar is in the middle, it's never going to actually get up to the edges of your carpet. But it has got this little spinning thing at the front which will flick loose stuff back into the center of its path, and that works really well, especially on hard floors. But of course it's not quite as effective on carpet. You know, if something's on there, it's not going to actually scoop it off the edge of the carpet. So the edges of your carpets are definitely not getting the same kind of attention that the bulk of them would get with this when it's running, which is of course why this is never going to replace a handheld vacuum. But it does really improve that day-to-day baseline, and it means you're not having to do a sort of daily top-up with your handheld vacuum. Downstairs here we're predominantly hard floors in the kitchen, the hallway and the lounge, but we have got a couple of rugs, so it's interesting to see how it deals with that situation of rugs on a hard floor, especially if you're mopping. So it actually can detect if it's on a carpet, and if the mop is attached it will back off as soon as it touches the carpet. So it's quite clever in that respect. So with the mop attached and you tell it to start an auto clean, it will actually vacuum and mop at the same time, but it will stop at the rugs. So that does actually work quite well. You can obviously set it to do just a mop, in which case it turns the vacuum off but carries on mopping. Again, it will avoid the rugs in that situation. And of course, if you did want to set anything manually in the maps, you can actually set exclusion zones that are specific to mopping. So if it's actually mopping, whether or not it's in auto mode or not, if it's got the mop attached, then it would avoid your exclusion zones that you set up for it in that mode. I actually set all these exclusion zones up for my rugs for mopping mode when I first got this because I didn't realize it had this ability to detect the rugs and back off whenever it's mopping. So in the app, there are quite a few different options. You can actually set it on this auto mode, which kind of bases itself on whether it's got the mop attached, and it will try and do both if it has the mop attached, otherwise it just vacuums. Or you can tell it just to do vacuuming, or you can tell it to just do mopping, or you can send it to a specific point on the map as well, and it'll do a little spot clean and then come back. Or you can set it to do region by region. So you could tell it to go and do a room, and it would bumble off from its base station through the corridors and find its room, do that room, and then come back again. So the app is actually pretty powerful. Once you figure it out, it's a little bit of a weird interface. This is quite often the case with these kind of Chinese brands. You've got pretty incredible hardware that can do awesome stuff, but the software side does let it down. You've kind of got to be a bit of a geek to get your head around the software, but the functionality is there. With any of these robotic kind of devices, it's the fringe situations that are always the things that trip it up. So I was kind of quite keen to live with it for a bit before I did this video, just so that I could see how many kind of weird quirks and weird situations we ended up with. So I'm going to go through these here just so that you're aware of the potential for these kinds of oddities to creep in. Sometimes it has actually got stuck on the edge of the rug. So where the gap between our rug and our little unit in the lounge is a certain sort of distance, it kind of gets one wheel up on the rug and it and it sort of gets stuck. It can't move itself off there. So sometimes it will get stuck in situations, but actually we solved that just by moving the rug a little bit further away from the unit there, so that gap wasn't at that sort of point where it got so confused. Obviously, I mentioned this weird error that I had when I first opened the app. I haven't seen that since, so I'm not quite sure what caused that or if I was doing it wrong and didn't really realize how the app worked. One time it did report the emptying bag as being full when it definitely wasn't. I'm not quite sure why it did that, but it hasn't come back. But it hasn't happened since, so it's not a super common problem. Another weird thing that's happened on only one occasion is I'd sent it on its way to do an auto clean for the downstairs, and about sort of 20 minutes in I realized it hadn't actually got the vacuum running. It was just driving around not doing anything at all. But the little thing was spinning away, but it wasn't vacuuming. Now you can control the vacuum setting in the app. You can have it off or on medium or high, so I'm not sure if I accidentally manually did that. It could well have been my error, but I didn't notice it and obviously had to start the whole thing again. So it's worth keeping an eye on those kinds of settings. Obviously you can hear the difference as well, so I wasn't really paying much attention to it. Sometimes it does get a little bit confused, even though it's mapped the whole floor. If there's a chair leg in the way or something, I mean, I've actually put the base station in a pretty weird place underneath my sofa, facing down the length of the sofa. It's quite close to the wall behind it on its right edge. It does suggest that you keep a gap all around the base station. So I'm kind of pushing my luck a little bit with that orientation. Generally, it does seem fine. It does manage to go back under the sofa and dock itself under there. This has been a few times where it's got a little bit confused and I've had to kind of manually put it back in the right place. One thing I'm not really a fan of is having this American feedback voice, which is obviously quite common with these kinds of Chinese products. They just use generic American feedback voices.
Test bin has been installed.
It's kind of annoying because the idea of having it announce its state to you is sort of quite useful. So I haven't actually turned it off. You can turn it off if you want to, and I might end up turning it off, but I'm kind of living with it at the moment. Of course, you can obviously see its state in the app at any time as well. But for this robot thing that's kind of doing its own thing, it is useful to be able to hear just from its feedback what kind of thing it's doing. Maybe a set of different noises might work better for this kind of thing. Essentially, it's mainly useful for sort of hearing if it's got itself stuck somewhere and you need to go and intervene with it. Now, initially, I couldn't find out how to connect it with Siri, so I actually emailed them. So I got a sort of flavor of what the technical support is like from this brand. Really good, helpful response in a very timely manner. Sent me straight to a video of the process of how to find the Siri shortcuts in the app. So it's definitely great support from this company. So overall, yeah, they do work. That it is actually providing a meaningfully useful improvement to our day-to-day vacuuming workflow. I don't need to use my handheld vacuum as often as I was before because I don't need to use it for these kind of daily top-ups anymore. I just send the vacuum out at a convenient time. And it's sort of a catalyst for us to have a little bit of a tidy up as well. So generally, the state of our floor is actually much clearer than it was before, where I would kind of put things off a little bit more. With this, I know that I can just have a quick tidy up and then send the robot out, and it will really top up the cleanliness of the floor. I'm still using the handheld for the deep cleans, of course, especially on the carpets and in particular on the edges of the carpets. It's worth mentioning that it has no problem getting over our little door thresholds between the rooms here either. In between our hallway and our kitchen, there's a sort of step down onto the lino. It has no issue getting up and down that either. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one where I look at the Smart Wings smart roller blinds, which are an interesting product again that I use day to day in real life in this house. I'm very keen on looking at smart technology that actually improves the day-to-day workflow. And as a result of that, I will always live with this stuff in real life before I make a video about them. And actually Smart Wings have now sent me this new thread motor, which is a massive improvement over the Bluetooth one. So where I talk about things like the delay and the noise in that video, those have actually been much improved in the thread motors. Actually a really cool product, so check that video out and I'll see you there.